On the cold morning of May 4th, 1932, Stockholm awoke without knowing that this day would forever change the way its inhabitants would sleep at night. The city, covered by a thick fog that clung to the cobblestone streets, held a macabre secret in one of its oldest neighborhoods. A secret that would soon become Sweden's most terrifying nightmare. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are? If you're looking to relax with true crime stories while listening to the rain, you've come to the right place. Subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, like this video and share it with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. Your support helps us continue bringing the most chilling cases in history. Mrs. Minnie Nielsen, a 55-year-old woman known for her obsessive punctuality, had not opened her small textile shop that morning. Her neighbors, puzzled by this unusual behavior, decided to investigate. What they found in her apartment in the Atlas building would be so disturbing that some of them would never be the same. The door was ajar, and from the hallway they could perceive something none of them expected to find. Mr. Eric Anderson, the building's baker, was the first to enter Minnie's apartment. The scene that greeted him made him immediately step back. His face lost all color, and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Minnie Nielsen lay in her bed, but she wasn't simply dead. Her body presented something that investigators had never seen in all of Sweden's criminal history. The corpse had been completely drained of blood. Every drop of blood had been extracted from her body with surgical precision that suggested advanced medical knowledge. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the absence of blood, but the way it had been removed. There were no signs of struggle, no disorder in the room, and the expression on Minnie's face was one of absolute peace, as if she had been sleeping when it happened. How was it possible for someone to perform such an act without the victim waking up or resisting? Stockholm police arrived within minutes, but what they found left them completely baffled. On the nightstand, next to Minnie's bed, there was a soup spoon stained with dried blood. An ordinary spoon, the kind anyone would have in their kitchen, but in that context it acquired a sinister meaning that no one could explain. What this spoon revealed about the killer was something that not even the most experienced detectives were prepared to understand. Inspector Anders Lindqvist, a Stockholm police veteran with over 20 years of experience, had seen his share of violent crimes. He had investigated crimes of passion, robberies gone wrong, even some poisoning cases. But nothing, absolutely nothing in his career had prepared him for this. As he examined Minnie Nielsen's body, a feeling of unease began to take hold of him. The coroner, Dr. Gustav Carlson, performed the autopsy that same afternoon. His findings were so baffling that he requested a second opinion from 2 colleagues before presenting his official report. Minnie's body contained less than 10% of the blood that an adult human should have. The veins and arteries were collapsed, as if something or someone had methodically sucked every drop of blood from her circulatory system. There were no significant external wounds, only 2 small marks on the neck, almost imperceptible. 2 small marks on the neck, separated by exactly 3 centimeters. Perfectly symmetrical. Dr. Carlson, a man of science who didn't believe in superstitions, found himself thinking about something he never imagined he would seriously consider. The marks were identical to the descriptions he had read in old European legends about creatures of the night. But the scientific explanation he was about to discover would be even more terrifying. News of the murder spread through Stockholm like wildfire. The newspapers, hungry for a sensational story, began publishing increasingly dramatic headlines. The Atlas vampire strikes, proclaimed Aftonbladet on its front page. Death by exsanguination in the heart of Stockholm, declared Svenska Dagbladet. The city, normally calm and orderly, began to sink into a state of collective panic. Inspector Lindqvist called an emergency meeting with his team. In the central station's conference room, he spread out all the evidence on a long table. The blood-stained spoon, photographs of the body, the autopsy report, witness testimonies from neighbors. Every piece of the puzzle was there, but none fit logically. It was as if they were trying to solve a crime that defied the laws of reality. "Gentlemen," Lindqvist began, his deep voice resonating in the silent room, "we are facing a killer with advanced medical knowledge, access to surgical instruments, and a methodology so precise that he left practically no forensic evidence. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of his detectives. But there's something else. Something none of you want to admit, but that you're all thinking. What he was about to say would divide his team and change the course of the entire investigation. While the police worked on scientific and rational theories, the residents of the Atlas building had their own explanations. Mrs. Bergstrom, a 70-year-old woman who lived on the top floor, claimed to have heard strange sounds the night of the murder. They weren't footsteps or voices, but something she described as a liquid whisper, a sound she had never heard before and that had kept her awake all night. Young Lars Eriksson, a medical student who occupied the apartment adjacent to Minnie's, revealed a disturbing detail to the police. 3 days before the murder, he had seen a tall, thin man, dressed in a long black coat, leaving the Atlas building near midnight. What caught his attention was that the man walked with an unnatural grace, almost floating over the steps, and when he briefly turned his face toward Lars, his eyes seemed to reflect the moonlight in a way that wasn't completely human. Lars's description was so specific and detailed that Inspector Lindqvist ordered a forensic artist to create a portrait of the suspect. When the drawing was finished, something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Bergstrom, upon seeing the portrait, visibly paled and began to tremble. "That man," she whispered with a broken voice. "I saw that same man 20 years ago during the last unsolved exsanguination case in Stockholm, and he hasn't aged a single day." What the police archives revealed about that old case would make the entire team question what they knew about reality. In the depths of Stockholm's municipal archives, covered by 2 decades of dust and oblivion, Inspector Lindqvist found a file that would change everything. The 1912 case had been filed as death by unknown causes, but the details were disturbingly similar. A middle-aged woman, found in her apartment, completely drained of blood, with 2 small marks on her neck. The case was never solved. What made the inspector's breath catch was the photograph attached to the file. At the 1912 crime scene, investigators had photographed the onlookers who had gathered outside the building. Among the crowd, clearly visible in the blurry but identifiable image, was the same man from the portrait that Lars Eriksson had described. The same angular face, the same piercing eyes, the same thin build. 20 years later, showing not a day of aging. Lindqvist immediately called Dr. Carlson to show him the file. Both men, sitting in the inspector's office under the dim light of a desk lamp, faced an impossible reality. "Anders," said the coroner with a trembling voice, "there are things in this world that science still cannot explain. I've spent my entire life studying the human body, and I can tell you with certainty that what was done to Minnie Nielsen requires more than medical knowledge." He paused, carefully choosing his next words. "It requires something I never thought I would say out loud." But before he could finish his sentence, the phone on the inspector's desk began to ring urgently, bringing news that would confirm their worst fears. It was Sergeant Olson on the phone, his voice altered by panic. "Inspector, you need to come immediately to the Vasastan district. There's another body. Same characteristics. Complete exsanguination." Lindqvist's heart sank. He had feared this moment since they found Minnie Nielsen. A killer who murders in this way doesn't stop with a single victim. The second victim was Helena Johansson, a 32-year-old nurse who lived alone in a modest apartment just 10 blocks from the Atlas building. The scene was an almost exact replica of the first murder. The body in the bed, the peaceful expression, the 2 marks on the neck, and next to the nightstand, another spoon stained with blood. But this time there was something different, something that made Inspector Lindqvist feel a chill run down his spine. On Helena's bedroom mirror, written with what appeared to be blood, there was a message. Only 3 words in Old Swedish, "De noche vengo," "I come at night." The handwriting was elegant, almost artistic, executed with a precision that suggested the killer had taken his time. There was no rush, no fear of being discovered. It was as if he wanted them to know he would strike again, and that there was nothing they could do to stop him. The handwriting analysis would reveal something that would take the investigation in a direction no one had anticipated. The graphological analysis of the message was sent to Professor Magnus Lindström, an expert in historical calligraphy from Uppsala University. His response arrived 2 days later, and it was as baffling as the case itself. The writing was not only in Old Swedish, but used a specific form of calligraphy that had been in use during the 17th century. More specifically, it was the style used by nobles and the educated class during the era of the Swedish Empire. "It's impossible," the professor wrote in his report, "for anyone in modern Sweden to write this way without extensive and dedicated study of historical texts. The strokes, the pen pressure, even the angle of inclination, everything corresponds to writing techniques that disappeared more than 200 years ago. But there was more. The chemical analysis of the blood used to write the message revealed that it didn't belong to Helena Johansson. It belonged to Minnie Nielsen, the first victim. This meant that the killer had preserved the blood of his first victim for several days, keeping it liquid and usable. To achieve this, he would need very specific storage conditions and possibly anticoagulants. Dr. Carlson explained to the team that keeping blood fresh outside the body for that long without modern medical equipment was almost impossible. Unless, he added with a somber voice, the killer has a method we don't know, a technique that has remained hidden for centuries. The investigation was about to take a turn toward the supernatural, but what they would discover in the church archives would prepare them to face an even darker truth. Following a hunch he couldn't rationally explain, Inspector Lindqvist visited the old Riddarholm Church, one of Stockholm's oldest constructions. He asked Father Johannes Lundberg for access to the parish's historical records, specifically those related to unexplained deaths during the 17th and 18th centuries. The elderly priest looked at him with an expression that mixed understanding and fear. "I knew someone would come asking sooner or later," said Father Lundberg as he guided him through stone corridors to an underground room. The archives were stored on old wooden shelves, protected from the passage of time by the cold, dry air of the basement. There are stories in these books that the church decided not to share publicly. Stories that question everything we think we know about good and evil. Father Lundberg extracted a particularly old volume, its pages yellowed and fragile. He carefully opened it to a section marked with a red ribbon. There, in an entry dated October 15, 1692, there was a record of several unexplained deaths in the Gamla Stan district. The victims had been found drained of blood, with marks on their necks, and local residents had reported the presence of a tall man dressed in black who disappeared into the shadows. The suspect's name was clearly written in the margin: the noble Alaric von Fersen, upon whom suspicions of dark practices weigh. What happened to von Fersen, according to the records, would make the entire case take a turn toward the impossible. The church records contained something that no modern police file would include: an official exorcism. The noble Alaric von Fersen had been subjected to an exorcism ritual on November 3, 1692, carried out by 3 bishops and documented with meticulous detail. According to the record, von Fersen had confessed under ecclesiastical pressure that he had been drinking the vital essence of the innocent to prolong his earthly existence beyond natural limits. What was most disturbing was what came after. The exorcism apparently failed. Von Fersen escaped during the ritual, killing 2 guards in the process. The last record about him dated from November 15, 1692. The demon von Fersen has fled into the shadows. May God protect the innocent from his eternal thirst. His crimes will continue until he is purified by divine light or completely destroyed. Inspector Lindqvist photographed every relevant page of the archives. As he did so, Father Lundberg revealed something else to him. "Inspector, there is a secret society in Stockholm, formed in the 18th century with the sole purpose of tracking and documenting von Fersen's appearances. They've never been able to capture him, but they maintain records of every suspicious death that matches his method. If he has truly returned, they will know." The priest handed him a card with a handwritten address. "Go tonight. Ask for the Brotherhood of Eternal Light. They have answers that the police will never find." What the inspector would discover at that secret meeting would force him to make a decision that could cost him his career, or even his life. The address on the card led to an old bookstore in the Gamla Stan district, Stockholm's historic heart. At 11 p.m., just as Father Lundberg had instructed him, Inspector Lindqvist knocked on the back door of the shop. A man about 60 years old, with a gray beard and penetrating eyes, opened without asking questions. "We were expecting you, Inspector. Please, follow me." The back room of the bookstore was much larger than it appeared from outside. The walls were covered with old maps of Stockholm, each marked with red XS in different locations. There was a long table in the center, surrounded by 8 people of different ages. They all looked at him with a mixture of solemnity and expectation. The man who had received him introduced himself as Karl Sundström, leader of the Brotherhood of Eternal Light. "Inspector Lindqvist," Sundström began, "our organization has existed for 240 years with a single purpose: to document and, if possible, stop Alaric von Fersen. Each generation of our Brotherhood has inherited this mission, and each generation has failed." He paused, pointing to the maps on the walls. "Each red X marks a place where von Fersen has killed. There are 87 marks on these maps. 87 lives taken over nearly 3 centuries. And now, Inspector, 2 more have just been added." Sundström slid a thick folder across the table. "This is everything we know about him. But there's something you must understand before opening that folder. Once you know the complete truth, there will be no turning back. Your vision of reality will change forever." The inspector, with trembling hands, opened the folder and began to read a horror that would challenge everything he believed. Inside the folder were documents dating from 1692 to 1932, meticulously organized and preserved. The Brotherhood had tracked every known appearance of von Fersen, and there was a clear pattern. He killed in cycles of approximately 20 years, taking between 2 and 5 victims in each cycle before disappearing again into the shadows. The last cycle before 1932 had been in 1912, exactly 20 years earlier. But there was more in the documents. The Brotherhood had collected testimonies from survivors, people who had encountered von Fersen but whom, for some reason, he had spared. These testimonies painted a terrifying picture of the immortal noble. Von Fersen didn't kill out of necessity, but for pleasure. He carefully selected his victims, studying them for days before attacking. He was intelligent, cultured, and completely devoid of human empathy. "There's something else you should know," said Sundström, pointing to a specific section of the documents. "Von Fersen cannot be killed by conventional methods. The Brotherhood has tried 3 times in its history. In 1723, a group of our predecessors managed to corner him in an abandoned house and tried to burn him alive. The house was reduced to ashes, but von Fersen escaped unharmed. In 1809, they tried to decapitate him. The sword broke before touching his neck. In 1876, they tried to drown him in the Mälaren. He emerged from the water after being submerged for more than 20 minutes, laughing." Sundström looked directly into the inspector's eyes. "But there is a weakness. A single method that, according to our research, might work." What he was about to reveal sounded like something out of old legends, but it was the only hope they had. Sundström got up from the table and walked toward a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened it carefully and extracted a wooden box carved with strange symbols. When he opened it, Inspector Lindqvist saw something he never expected to see in civilian hands. An ancient wooden stake, darkened by time, with Latin inscriptions engraved on its surface. This stake was carved in 1695 from the wood of a tree that grew on consecrated ground, Sundström explained. It was blessed by Pope Innocent XII personally, when the Brotherhood sent a delegation to Rome seeking help. Legend says it's the only weapon that can truly destroy von Fersen, but it must pierce his heart during the hours between midnight and dawn, when his power is at its weakest. Inspector Lindqvist, a man of science and reason, found himself holding a vampire stake in his hands, seriously considering using it. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his entire career solving crimes with forensic evidence and deductive logic, and now he was planning to hunt an immortal vampire with a piece of blessed wood. But the facts were undeniable. 2 women were dead, drained of blood in a way that no modern science could explain. and all paths of evidence led to a single impossible conclusion. "If we do this," Lindqvist said, his voice firm despite the surreal situation, "we'll need a plan. Von Fersen has survived for 3 centuries because he's smarter than all of us. But he makes one mistake." He looked up at the expectant faces of the Brotherhood. "He always returns to the scene of his crimes, and I know exactly how to trap him." The plan he was about to propose was bold, dangerous, and probably suicidal, but it was their only chance. The plan was simple but risky. The Brotherhood had documented that von Fersen visited his victims' homes during the 3 nights following each murder, apparently delighting in the scene of his crime. Helena Johansson's apartment, the second victim, would be watched throughout the night. Inspector Lindqvist and 4 members of the Brotherhood would hide inside, waiting for von Fersen to appear. The preparation was meticulous. They placed mirrors at strategic angles to ensure there were no blind spots. They blessed the apartment with holy water, another element that, according to the Brotherhood, might weaken von Fersen. The inspector carried his service revolver, although he knew the bullets would probably be useless. The ancient stake was wrapped in a white cloth, ready to be used when the moment came. The first night of surveillance passed without incident, the second as well. But on the third night, at 2:37 a.m., something changed. The temperature in the apartment dropped dramatically, so much so that the inspector could see his own breath condensing in the air. The candles they had placed around the room began to flicker violently, although there were no drafts. And then, without any door opening, without any window moving, he was simply there. Alaric von Fersen had arrived, and what happened next would test the courage of everyone present in ways they never imagined. Von Fersen was exactly as the historical testimonies had described. Tall, thin in build, but with a presence that filled the entire room. His face was pale, almost translucent, with perfectly chiseled aristocratic features. But it was his eyes that truly terrified, black as bottomless pits, without a single glimmer of humanity in them. He wore a long black coat in the 17th century style, immaculately preserved despite the centuries. "Good evening, gentlemen," said von Fersen with a soft, cultured voice, speaking Swedish with an antiquated accent. "I must admit I expected visitors, but not so soon. The Brotherhood of Eternal Light, correct? You've been persistent over the years, though never particularly effective." His eyes settled on Inspector Lindqvist. "And you must be the detective. How fascinating. A man of law trying to arrest something that transcends your mortal laws." The inspector stepped forward, trying to maintain his composure. "Alaric von Fersen, you are under arrest for the murders of Minnie Nielsen and Helena Johansson." Even as he spoke the words, he realized how absurd they sounded. Von Fersen simply smiled, revealing perfectly white teeth, except for the canines, which were slightly longer and sharper than normal. "Arrest?" laughed von Fersen, a sound that made the inspector feel a penetrating cold in his soul. "Inspector, I have walked this earth for more than 300 years. I have seen empires fall. I have witnessed wars that consumed continents. I have been witness to the birth of the modern science you value so much. And you think you can arrest me?" His expression changed, becoming more serious and threatening. "Let me show you what power truly means." What von Fersen did next would make 2 of the Brotherhood's men flee in terror from the apartment. Swearing never to speak of what they saw, von Fersen slowly raised a hand, and without touching it, one of the mirrors they had carefully placed exploded into 1,000 fragments. The pieces of glass floated in the air for a moment, suspended by an invisible force, before falling to the floor. The message was clear. Their preparations were useless against him. He could control the physical environment at will. 3 centuries ago, von Fersen began, pacing through the room as if it were his. "I was a noble, a man of science and ambition. I studied the dark arts not out of malice, but out of intellectual curiosity. I sought to answer the fundamental question that has tormented humanity since the beginning: how to defeat death." He stopped in front of a photograph of Helena Johansson on the wall. "And I found the answer. Blood is life, literally. It contains the vital essence that our bodies constantly consume. But if one learns to take it from others, to process it in the right way, one can stop the biological clock indefinitely. Inspector Lindqvist felt his hand slowly moving toward the stake hidden under his coat. Von Fersen noticed the movement immediately and in an instant was in front of the inspector, so close he could feel his icy breath. Ah, the Brotherhood's famous stake. Yes, I know of its existence. They've been chasing me with it for centuries. Von Fersen extended his hand. Go ahead, Inspector. Try it. Let's see if the legends are true. It was an obvious trap, but the inspector had no choice. With a quick movement, he pulled out the stake and thrust it with all his strength toward Von Fersen's chest. What happened next defied all the laws of physics that the inspector knew. The stake pierced Von Fersen's chest, penetrating exactly where his heart should be. For a moment, everything stopped. The vampire looked down, observing the stake protruding from his chest with an expression of genuine surprise. Inspector Lindqvist felt a wave of hope. Had it worked? Had he really ended the 300-year curse? But then Von Fersen began to laugh. It was a soft laugh at first, gradually growing until it became laughter that resonated on the apartment walls. With a casual movement, he grabbed the stake and extracted it from his own chest, showing no signs of pain. There was no blood. The hole in his clothing closed before their eyes, as if the fabric itself were alive. Impressive attempt, said Von Fersen, examining the stake with academic interest. The wood is genuine. The blessings are authentic. I even felt something when it touched me. A slight tingling, I would say. But you see, gentlemen, there is a small detail that your legends don't mention. He held the stake in front of the inspector's face. The stake must pierce a heart that still beats. My heart stopped beating in 1693. I am, in the most literal sense, a corpse animated by forces that science doesn't yet understand. The silence that followed was absolute. The Brotherhood members who remained in the room looked at each other with desperation. If their most powerful weapon was useless, what hope did they have? Von Fersen, however, did something completely unexpected. He returned the stake to the inspector and stepped back. But I haven't come here tonight to kill you. I've come with a proposal. What he was about to offer would divide the group and create a moral decision that none were prepared to make. I have walked among you for 3 centuries, Von Fersen continued, his voice adopting an almost diplomatic tone. And I have learned something important. Humanity advances, science progresses, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for someone like me to exist without being detected. What once took days to investigate now takes hours. Your forensic methods, your communication systems, will soon make it impossible for beings like me to operate in the shadows. He walked toward the window, looking out at the illuminated streets of Stockholm. So I propose a deal to you. Allow me to take 1 victim every 20 years, just 1, and the rest of the time I will disappear completely. There will be no more multiple murders, no more panic in the streets. 1 life every 2 decades in exchange for avoiding the death cycles I've caused in the past. It is, if you think about it logically, the lesser of 2 evils. Inspector Lindqvist felt nauseous at the proposal. You're suggesting we allow you to kill an innocent person every 20 years, that we become accomplices to murder, just to prevent you from killing more people. That's monstrous. But even as he spoke, a part of his mind was coldly calculating. If Von Fersen was truly unstoppable, if there was no way to kill him, wouldn't it be less horrible to allow 1 death every 20 years instead of several? The proposal was diabolical precisely because it had a perverse logic. Sundström, the Brotherhood's leader, spoke for the first time since Von Fersen appeared. Our ancestors rejected similar proposals 3 times in our history. We have always believed there must be a way to destroy you, that no being can be truly immortal. Von Fersen turned to him with a sad smile. And how many have died while searching for that way, Mr. Sundström? How many generations of the Brotherhood have dedicated their lives to a futile quest? The room fell into a tense silence as each man struggled with his own conscience. But the decision they were about to make would be interrupted by a discovery that would change everything. In the midst of the moral deliberation, the Brotherhood's youngest member, a theology student named Oscar Lindgren, had been examining the ancient documents more closely. Suddenly, he let out a choked exclamation. "Wait! There's something here we all overlooked." His hands trembled as he held a particularly old page, written in Latin. "It's from the original testimony of the 1692 exorcism," Oscar explained, quickly translating. "It says that von Fersen confessed that his immortality is tied to an object, something he created during his original transformation ritual. A silver chalice containing a drop of his mortal blood, the last drop of blood his heart pumped before it stopped beating. As long as that chalice exists, he cannot be destroyed. But if the chalice is destroyed..." Von Fersen, for the first time since his appearance, showed genuine emotion. Fear. "Shut up, boy. You don't know what you're talking about." But the vampire's reaction only confirmed that Oscar had found something truly significant. The student continued reading. The chalice was hidden by von Fersen somewhere in Stockholm before his complete transformation. The exorcists tried to force him to reveal its location, but he resisted. The document ends with a note. "The chalice remains hidden, and as long as it does, the beast cannot be vanquished." Inspector Lindqvist saw a flash of something in von Fersen's eyes he had never seen before: vulnerability. "For 3 centuries, said the vampire with a tense voice, "I have guarded the secret of that chalice. It's hidden in a place where no one would think to look, protected by wards that no mortal can cross." But in saying these words, he made a crucial mistake. Von Fersen had inadvertently revealed that the chalice was magically protected, which meant it must be in a place with historical or spiritual significance. The inspector, trained to catch every detail, was already forming a theory about where it might be hidden. Inspector Lindqvist remembered something Father Lundberg had mentioned in passing during their conversation at the church. In 1692, just before the failed exorcism, von Fersen had made a considerable donation to Ridderholm Church and had specifically requested permission to place a commemorative plaque in the family crypt. A plaque that, according to the records, had never been opened for inspection. "The von Fersen crypt," the inspector said aloud, watching as Alaric's expression transformed from vulnerability to pure terror. "You hid your chalice in your own family tomb, protected by sacred ground, trusting that the irony would be too obvious for anyone to consider." Von Fersen lunged toward the inspector with superhuman speed, but Sundstrom and the other Brotherhood members intercepted him with blessed crosses, forcing him to retreat. "You won't get there in time," shouted von Fersen as he disappeared into a dark mist. "I'll get there first and move the chalice." But the vampire had made his final mistake. By indirectly confirming the chalice's location, he had sealed his fate. The group ran to Ridderholm Church. Father Lundberg, alerted by phone, was already opening the crypt when they arrived. Inside the von Fersen family tomb, behind a marble plaque with Alaric's name, they found a secret niche. Inside, a silver chalice blackened by time, with intricate runic inscriptions engraved on its surface. Within the chalice, a single drop of dark blood that, incredibly, still remained liquid after 3 centuries. Von Fersen appeared at the crypt entrance, his face contorted into a mask of fury and desperation. "Please," he begged. All his previous arrogance evaporated. "I have existed for so long. I have seen so much. I don't deserve to simply disappear." Inspector Lindqvist held the chalice in his hands. Minnie Nielsen and Helena Johansson also deserved to live. And the other 85 victims you've taken over the centuries. This ends now. With a deliberate movement, the inspector threw the chalice against the stone floor of the crypt. It shattered with a crystalline sound that resonated on the ancient walls. The drop of blood instantly evaporated into the air, turning into a red mist that disappeared. Von Fersen let out a scream that wasn't completely human, a sound of agony that came from 3 centuries of unnatural existence coming to an end. The vampire's body began to disintegrate. First his skin turned gray and wrinkled, then began to crumble like ashes. Within seconds, the noble Alaric von Fersen, the Atlas vampire, was reduced to a pile of dust on the crypt floor. The reign of terror that had lasted 3 centuries had finally ended. Stockholm's newspapers never reported the true nature of the Atlas murders. Officially, an unknown serial killer had committed 2 homicides before disappearing, presumably fleeing the city. Inspector Lindqvist received a commendation for his work on the case, though he could never reveal the real details of what had occurred. The Brotherhood of Eternal Light continued to exist, but their mission had changed. They were no longer hunters, but archivists, maintaining von Fersen's records as a reminder that the world contains mysteries that science still cannot fully explain. The case file was sealed in the deepest archives of the Stockholm police, marked with a simple note: closed due to extraordinary circumstances. On quiet nights in Stockholm, when the fog creeps through the old streets of Gamlestan, some older residents still tell stories about the Atlas vampire. Most dismiss them as urban legends, tales designed to frighten children. But those who know the truth, the descendants of the Brotherhood and the few detectives who have access to the sealed archives, know better. They know that for a brief moment in 1932, Stockholm faced a darkness that didn't belong to the modern world, a reminder that some ancient evils sleep in the shadows of history, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And on the darkest nights, when the wind blows from the Mälaren and the streets are empty, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the distant echo of a liquid whisper, a reminder that the world is much stranger and more terrifying than we allow our rational minds to accept. The story of the Atlas vampire is real, and there are other stories, other mysteries buried in the archives of ancient cities around the world, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to discover them. If you're new here, welcome to our channel. We specialize in true crime stories told in a calming voice, accompanied by gentle rain, sounds to help you drift off to sleep. If you enjoy tonight's mystery, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you're feeling generous, a like on this video helps us tremendously. It tells YouTube to share our content with others who might enjoy it. Feel free to share this with anyone who loves true crime or needs help falling asleep. What time is it where you are? Leave a comment and let me know. There's something comforting about knowing we're all here together, scattered across time zones, but united by our fascination with the unexplained. Now settle in. Get comfortable. Tonight, we're traveling back to December 1919, to the snow-covered streets of Toronto, Canada. This is the story of a man who vanished into thin air on the night of his greatest triumph. A millionaire theater owner who stepped out of his office and was never seen again. Despite one of the most extensive investigations in Canadian history, despite countless theories and suspects, despite a fortune waiting to be claimed, Ambrose Small simply ceased to exist. And the question that has haunted investigators for over a century remains: what happened to Ambrose Small? The snow fell thick and heavy over Toronto on the evening of December 2nd, 1919. It was the kind of snow that muffled sound, that transformed the city into something quieter, more secretive. The streets glistened under the gas lamps, and in the theater district, the marquees blazed with promise. Ambrose Small should have been celebrating. After all, he had just completed the business transaction of his lifetime, the sale of his theater empire for $1.7 million. An astronomical sum in 1919. That's equivalent to roughly $27 million today. He was 56 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and finally free from the daily grind of managing his theatrical holdings across Canada. But those who saw him that day would later remember something troubling in his demeanor. He seemed distracted, perhaps even anxious, though he tried to hide it behind his usual brusque manner. What was weighing on his mind as he walked through his grand opera house that afternoon? He had meetings to attend, papers to sign, details to finalize. The sale to the Trans-Canada Theatre Company had been agreed upon, but there were still loose ends. Money to be transferred, counts to be settled. Ambrose Small was nothing if not meticulous about money. Some would say obsessed with it. He had not become one of the richest men in Toronto by being careless. That afternoon, he had lunch at the Grand Opera House with his lawyer, E.W.M. Flock. They discussed the details of the sale. Small seemed satisfied, even pleased. After lunch, they walked together to the Dominion Bank, where Small deposited a check for $100,000, just a portion of his vast new fortune. The bank manager watched as Small endorsed the check with his distinctive signature, never imagining it would be one of the last times anyone saw Ambrose Small conduct business. But something happened after that bank visit. Something that would change everything. Because when Small returned to his office at the Grand Opera House, he made a decision that would puzzle investigators for decades. What did he do in those final hours before he vanished? To understand what happened to Ambrose Small, you must first understand who he was. And Ambrose Small was not a man who inspired lukewarm feelings. People either admired his business acumen or despised his ruthlessness. There was no middle ground. Born in 1863 to a middle-class family in Bradford, Ontario, Ambrose showed an early aptitude for business. But it was in the theater industry that he found his calling. By the 1890s, he was acquiring theaters across Ontario, building an empire that would eventually span the entire country. He owned the Grand Opera House in Toronto, the Grand Theatre in London, theaters in Hamilton, Kingston, Peterborough, and beyond. He was known as a hard bargainer, someone who squeezed every penny from his investments. His theaters were profitable, but not because he was generous. Performers complained about his low wages. Employees whispered about his temper. He had a reputation for being difficult, demanding, and utterly uncompromising. His marriage to Teresa Corman in 1902 had been seen by Toronto society as something of a surprise. Teresa came from a wealthy Catholic family, well-educated and cultured. She was everything Ambrose was not: refined, devout, patient. Why she married him remained a topic of speculation in Toronto's drawing rooms. Some said it was for family business connections. Others suggested that Teresa saw something in Ambrose that others missed, some hidden depth beneath his harsh exterior. But by 1919, the marriage had grown cold. They lived together in their mansion at 103 Glen Road in Rosedale, Toronto's most prestigious neighborhood, but they lived separate lives. Ambrose was rarely home. He spent his evenings at his theaters, his nights at his private clubs, often in the company of women who were not his wife. And then there was his secretary, John Doughty, a quiet, efficient man who had worked for Small for years, handling the endless details of the theater business. Doughty knew everything about Small's affairs, business and otherwise. He knew where the money went, who owed Small money, and who Small owed. He was privy to secrets that others could only guess at. On that December evening in 1919, Doughty was still at the Grand Opera House. He would be one of the last people to see Ambrose Small alive. But what passed between them in those final hours would become the subject of intense scrutiny. Because by the next morning, both men would be gone from Toronto, and only one would ever return. After returning from the bank at approximately 3:30 p.m., Ambrose Small entered his office on the ground floor of the Grand Opera House. The building was bustling with the usual afternoon activity. Stagehands preparing for the evening performance, box office clerks counting receipts, actors arriving for makeup calls. Small's office was located just off the main lobby, a modest room that belied his wealth. Unlike many successful men of his era, Small did not believe in ostentatious displays. His desk was practical, his furnishings functional. What mattered to him was what the ledgers said, not how the office looked. John Doughty followed him into the office. They had business to discuss, always more business. Small's secretary was a man of about 35, thin and nervous in manner, with spectacles that he constantly adjusted. He had been with Small long enough to anticipate his moods, to know when to speak and when to remain silent. What they discussed in that office has never been fully established. Later, Doughty would tell investigators that they reviewed various financial matters related to the sale. There were bonds to be transferred, accounts to be reconciled. It was routine work, or so Doughty claimed. But there was something else happening that afternoon, something that wouldn't come to light immediately. Small received a telephone call around 5 p.m. Who was on the other end of that call? Doughty said he didn't know. Small took the call privately, asking his secretary to step out of the office. When Doughty returned a few minutes later, Small seemed agitated. He was pacing, something he did when troubled. Shortly after 5:30 p.m., Ambrose Small put on his overcoat and hat. He told Doughty he was going to the Grand Theatre on Adelaide Street, another of his properties, to check on something. Doughty offered to accompany him, but Small declined. He said he would return within the hour. The stage doorman, a man named Thomas Small, no relation, watched as Ambrose Small walked out into the snowy evening. He turned west on Adelaide Street and disappeared into the crowds of shoppers and theatergoers heading home for dinner. Thomas Small was certain of what he saw, because he checked his watch. It was 5:45 p.m. exactly. He had no reason to believe it was significant at the time. After all, Ambrose Small came and went from his theaters at all hours. There was nothing unusual about it. Except that this time, Ambrose Small never came back. And when investigators tried to trace his movements after he left that door, they discovered something that would deepen the mystery immeasurably. Several witnesses claimed to have seen Small that evening, but their accounts contradicted each other in ways that made no sense. Where did Ambrose Small go after leaving the Grand Opera House? Teresa Small was not immediately concerned when her husband didn't come home that night. This was not unusual behavior for Ambrose. He often stayed late at one of his theaters or spent the night at his club. Their marriage had evolved into an arrangement of mutual tolerance. She managed the household and her social obligations. He managed his business and his diversions. They had learned not to question each other too closely. But when December 3rd arrived and there was still no word from Ambrose, Teresa began to feel the first stirrings of unease. She telephoned the Grand Opera House. John Doughty answered. No, he told her Mr. Small had not been in that morning. He had left the previous evening around 5:45 and hadn't returned. Did he say where he was going? Teresa asked. Doughty hesitated. He said he was going to check on something at the Grand Theatre, but I don't know if he actually went there. The Grand Theatre. Teresa called there next. No, the manager told her Mr. Small had not been there the previous evening. No one had seen him. Now the unease blossomed into something sharper. Teresa Small was a pragmatic woman, not given to panic or dramatics, but she knew her husband's habits. Even when he was conducting his various affairs, even when he was gambling at his clubs, he always checked in eventually. He was compulsive about his businesses, about knowing what was happening at each of his theaters. For him to simply vanish without a word to anyone was unthinkable. She called his lawyer EWM Flock. Had he heard from Ambrose? No, Flock said, not since their lunch the previous day. He sounded puzzled. They had just completed a massive sale. Surely Small would want to follow up on the details. Teresa spent December 3rd making calls, checking with anyone who might have seen or heard from her husband, his club, his business associates, the managers of his various theaters. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. It was as if Ambrose Small had stepped out of the Grand Opera House and stepped out of existence. On the morning of December 4th, Teresa Small did something she would never have done under normal circumstances. She went to the police. Detective Inspector George Kennedy of the Toronto Police received her in his office at City Hall. He listened as she described her husband's disappearance, making notes in his careful hand. When she finished, he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Mrs. Small, he said slowly, I need to ask you something directly. Is it possible your husband simply left? That he decided to start a new life somewhere else? Teresa stiffened. Without his fortune? Without access to his bank accounts? Inspector, my husband just sold his business for $1.7 million. Why would he walk away from that? It was a fair question. And it was that question that would transform Ambrose Small's disappearance from a missing person case into something far more sinister. Because as Inspector Kennedy began his investigation, he would discover that the money from the sale had never been properly deposited. And John Doughty, the loyal secretary who knew all of Small's secrets, had also disappeared. Inspector Kennedy was a methodical man, respected throughout the Toronto Police for his thoroughness. He had solved numerous cases through patient investigation and attention to detail. But even he had to admit that the disappearance of Ambrose Small presented unusual challenges from the very beginning. His first action was to visit the Grand Opera House. He interviewed the staff, starting with the stage doorman who had seen Small leave on the evening of December 2nd. The man was certain of the time, 5:45 p.m., and certain of the direction Small had walked, west on Adelaide Street. Kennedy then asked to speak with John Dowdy. That's when he learned something that immediately elevated his concern. Dowdy had not been seen since December 2nd either. He had left the Grand Opera House shortly after Small, telling another employee he was going home. But when Kennedy sent officers to Dowdy's boarding house, the landlady reported that Dowdy had packed a bag and left on December 3rd, saying he was going to visit family. Did he say which family? Kennedy asked. No, the landlady replied, and I didn't ask. He paid his rent through the month, so I had no reason to question him. This was troubling, very troubling. Kennedy returned to the Grand Opera House and requested access to Small's office and files. What he found there would transform the investigation into something far more complex. The financial records were in disarray. Papers were missing. And most significantly, when Kennedy examined the books related to the theater sale, he discovered significant discrepancies. The sale had been for $1.7 million. Of that, $1 million had been in the form of a check which Small had deposited, or at least part of which he had deposited, on December 2nd. But the bonds that made up the remainder of the sale were missing. Bonds worth $700,000, negotiable and as good as cash if one knew how to handle them properly. John Dowdy, as Small's secretary, would have known exactly how to handle them. Kennedy sat in Small's office, staring at the empty spaces in the filing cabinets, and felt a cold certainty settle over him. This was not a simple disappearance. This was either a theft that had somehow gone terribly wrong or something far worse. But which was it? Had Dowdy stolen the bonds and fled, possibly killing Small to prevent discovery? Or had Small orchestrated his own disappearance, planning to blame Dowdy for the missing money? Or was there a third possibility, something Kennedy hadn't yet considered? He needed to find John Dowdy. That much was clear. Kennedy issued a bulletin to police departments across Canada and the United States. John Dowdy, age 35, thin build, wears spectacles, wanted for questioning in connection with the disappearance of Ambrose Small and the theft of negotiable bonds worth $700,000. The manhunt had begun. But what Kennedy didn't yet know was that finding Dowdy would only deepen the mystery, not solve it. Because when they finally tracked him down, Dowdy would tell a story that explained everything and nothing, that answered questions while raising even more troubling ones. Within days of Teresa Small's report, the disappearance of Ambrose Small became front-page news across Canada. The Toronto newspapers ran sensational headlines: "Millionaire theater owner vanishes. Secretary flees with fortune." The story had everything the public craved: wealth, mystery, possible betrayal, and the tantalizing question of whether a prominent man could simply disappear without a trace. Inspector Kennedy assembled a team of detectives and began a systematic investigation. They retraced Small's movements on December 2nd with meticulous care. The lunch with lawyer E.W.M. Flock, confirmed. The visit to the Dominion Bank to deposit the check, confirmed. The return to the Grand Opera House around 3:30 p.m., confirmed. The departure at 5:45 p.m., confirmed by the stage doorman. But after that, the trail became confused. A shopkeeper on Adelaide Street claimed to have seen Small walking west around 6 p.m. A cab driver reported picking up a man matching Small's description near the Grand Theatre around 6:30 p.m. and dropping him at Union Station. But the station master at Union Station had no record of Small purchasing a ticket, and none of the railway porters remembered seeing him. Other witnesses came forward with conflicting accounts. A woman claimed to have seen Small entering a restaurant on King Street around 7 p.m. A man insisted he'd seen Small getting into an automobile with two other men near the waterfront. Each lead was investigated. Each lead went nowhere. Kennedy expanded the search to Small's personal life. He interviewed Teresa Small again, this time asking more probing questions about her husband's habits, his associates, his enemies. Teresa was remarkably forthcoming, displaying none of the defensiveness one might expect from a wife whose husband's infidelities were about to become public knowledge. "Inspector," she said during one interview, "I'm not naive about my husband's character. He was not an easy man to live with. He had affairs, I knew about them. He gambled, I knew about that too. He had business rivals who disliked him intensely, but he was not a man who would abandon his fortune. Money was everything to Ambrose. Everything. So if he's missing, it's not by choice." "Can you think of anyone who might have wanted to harm him?" Kennedy asked. Teresa considered this carefully. "Inspector, my husband drove hard bargains. He foreclosed on people who couldn't pay their debts. He evicted tenants. He fired employees without much ceremony. In business, he made many enemies." "But murderous enemies? I honestly don't know." Kennedy's team began compiling a list of people who might have had grievances against Small. The list grew disturbingly long. Former business partners who felt cheated, theater managers he'd fired, actors he'd blacklisted, landlords whose properties he'd acquired through foreclosure. Some of these people had made threats against Small, according to witnesses. But threats were one thing. Following through was another. Meanwhile, the search for John Dowdy continued. Kennedy had officers checking train stations, interviewing ticket agents, showing Dowdy's photograph. The secretary had vanished as completely as his employer. But unlike Small, Dowdy had left traces. He had withdrawn money from his bank account on December 3rd, a significant sum of $2,000. He had told his landlady he was leaving. He had been seen boarding a train at Union Station heading west. On December 10th, Kennedy received a telegram that made his pulse quicken. Police in Detroit had detained a man matching Dowdy's description. Kennedy immediately arranged to travel to Detroit. Could this be the break he needed? Would Dowdy's capture finally solve the mystery of what happened to Ambrose Small? The man sitting in the Detroit police interrogation room looked exhausted and frightened. John Dowdy had been arrested at a boarding house in Detroit's downtown district, recognized by an alert landlady who had seen his photograph in the newspaper. He had offered no resistance when the police came for him. Inspector Kennedy entered the room and sat down across from Dowdy. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Dowdy was the first to speak. "I didn't kill him," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I swear to you, Inspector, I didn't kill Ambrose Small." "Then why did you run?" Kennedy asked calmly. Dowdy removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. "Because I knew how it would look. The bonds are missing. Mr. Small is missing. And I'm his secretary. I had access to everything. Who would believe me?" "Why don't you tell me what happened?" Kennedy suggested. "Start from the beginning."